Welcome, everyone. Apologies again for the technical issues with the video sound. Hopefully you can all hear me okay now. Welcome to today's webinar. We encourage you to connect with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading on social media. On YouTube, subscribe to our channel at Grade Level Reading. On LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram, follow us at Campaign for GLR. And on X, follow us at Reading by Third. Please use the hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to share anything you learned from today's webinar, and we will be sure to reshare. Once again, welcome to the conversation. My name is Sierra Sanchez, and I'll be behind the scenes helping to produce the webinar. Before we begin, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge our enterprise and our programmatic funders, as well as our individual donors. Your support not only allows us to hold these vital conversations, but also helps us create meaningful opportunities to share insights, foster connections, and build the CGLR community. Thank you. One more thing before we jump in, I want to share a few housekeeping tips with you. First, we'd love for you to introduce yourself, so please use the chat box at the bottom of your screen to share your name, city, or state, and your organization. Be sure when responding to select everyone so that we all know who is here, and feel free to share your thoughts and insights throughout the duration of the webinar. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but we encourage you to post any questions you might have in the Q&A box. Our panelists will be typing out responses throughout the webinar, and they will respond live at the end of the conversation. The webinar is also being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. A link to the recording, as well as all slides, bios, and resources, will be sent in a follow-up email to everyone who registered. And lastly, we will have a brief on-screen evaluation during Q&A and highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. So thank you in advance for filling that out. And last thing before we jump in, I just wanted to turn your attention to some of our upcoming webinars. Next week on October 7th, we have an exciting doubleheader, starting off with a Crucible of Practice Salon with Florida's Indian River County community with the Moonshot series preview at 12:30 p.m. On 3 p.m. that same day, we'll have an exciting conversation on book abundance for early learning and development, early literacy, and early school success. On October 14th, we'll have a partner webinar co-sponsored by Children's and Screens with Screens in the First 5 Years, What We Need to Know and Do. And on the 21st, we'll continue our Parents as Curators webinar series with this conversation focused on the evolution of homeschooling. More information and registration links for all of these great sessions will be posted in the chat box now, and we hope that you can join us. And joining you now is Hillary Jones, Senior Consultant with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome to our audience as we jump in today's session, Curriculum at a Crossroads, Evidence and What Works. Today, we're going to walk through our session looking at the crossroads between research, standards, and quality curriculum. And so I have the pleasure of introducing our presenters for today. First is Dr. Stephen M. Ross, a professor and executive director at the Center for Research and Reform in Education at Johns Hopkins University. Second, I have Teresa Eliopoulos, who is the policy and strategy lead at Ed Reports, where she analyzes the PK-12 instructional materials and policy landscape. And Dr. Janine Walker-Caffrey, who is the Chief Academic Officer at EPS Learning, career educator and author. So thank you all for joining us today. Our audience, you will have a chance to ask each of these folks more about their research and their expertise as we continue through this session today. We also have a phenomenal group of superintendents and leaders to share their reaction responses and reflections on what's shared today. And so first we have Dr. Bren Elliott, who is the Associate Superintendent of Student Life and Innovation for the School District of Philadelphia. We have with us Dr. David Pinder, the Superintendent of Schools for the Juvenile Services Education Program in Maryland, and Dr. Sean Stover, who is the Superintendent for Rockingham County Schools in North Carolina. Last, but certainly not least today, is Dr. Amanda Alexander, our moderator, a consultant who has over 25 years of work primarily focused on the areas of education, policy, practice, and research, and really the brain behind so much of this conversation today. So at this time, I'm going to pass it over to Amanda.
Well, Hillary, thanks so much for your kind words. I wasn't the sole brain behind this, but there were lots of great brains that led to the creation of this so desperately needed webinar at this time. And we're going to start today with Dr. Ross, who you know is at Johns Hopkins. And Dr. Ross, for you, I'd love for you to kick us off and help us understand ESSA, the tiers of evidence, and what practitioners essentially need to know about this, because I think it's a nice grounding for today's conversation.
Okay, thank you, Amanda, and I'd like to say good afternoon to everyone. For people in Hawaii, good morning, if there are any of you from Hawaii, but everybody else, I'm sure, is into the afternoon. I'd like to talk about evidence tiers and also evidence in general. Our center at Johns Hopkins, the Center for Research and Reform in Education, deals with evidence in two ways. One is by conducting third-party evaluations of educational programs, and the other is by housing evidence for ESSA, which disseminates evidence. So I'm going to talk a little bit about both. To talk about evidence tiers, and before we change the slide, we need to talk about how evidence really came into play, because a very monumental or change event occurred in 2015 that really changed the way that schools view evidence and changed the way that publishers and program developers view evidence. And that was the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA. And under the Every Student Succeeds Act, evidence requirements were stated as mattering when states, districts, or schools use federal funds to procure, meaning purchase or contract for, educational programs, curricula, interventions, or services. And the law requires that certain activities funded under ESSA, particularly school improvement activities, and we think of these as interventions or programs, they must be based on evidence-based interventions. So what is evidence-based? And let's take a look at the 4 ESSA tiers now. So we could go to the next slide. Now these tier, hit it again. You might as well put it all up there. Okay. These 4 tiers are pretty well known by, they're very well known by researchers, by program developers, and increasingly by school districts. They're certainly known by many procurement offices. They're misunderstood to some degree, and we're not going to get into the weeds on this brief presentation. But, I'll try to do some basic clarifications of what they involve. Let's start at the bottom. Tier 4 usually would be the level that a newly developed program would reach, a program that hasn't had time to really obtain evidence, to conduct a more rigorous study. And to achieve Tier 4, what we're looking for is demonstrating a rationale, research base. This particular program is based on a theoretical model, a logic model. So strictly speaking, in order to qualify for Tier 4, an intervention needs to be able to show a research-based logic model, and those aren't difficult to do. By the way, we have many different examples, so if any of you need any help with that, I can provide you with some examples. So you need a logic model and basically a research base for what you're doing instructionally or educationally. That might involve a quick review of the literature with some key studies. And you do need to have a Tier 3 study planned or underway. So they will want to see that there's a study planned, and if you say you have a plan, a particular program, and then don't do the study within reasonable time, then that tier 4 rating, strictly speaking, would be disqualified for it. So the study needs to be done. Okay, so we need a tier 3 study at some point to come up with promising evidence. By far, this is the most misunderstood tier of all of them, because when you check the description of what a tier 3 study involves, it's kind of vague. It says a correlational study, and then it says with comparison group equivalents. And what does that mean? So, although it's the afternoon, you might be tired after lunch, let me just give you a question to deal with and see what you come up with. Let's say a new reading supplementary program is developed in phonics, and it's introduced into a school district, and it's tried out with 100 students who use this new phonics program in grade 1. And the study ends up correlating the amount of student usage of the program with achievement gains. And lo and behold, a statistically significant correlation is found, showing that the more the program is used, the better the gain. Does that qualify for tier 3? Well, we're not going to take a show of hands, and I can't even see you for that matter. But if you said yes, you would be thinking of thinking in the same way that a number of program developers think, and the answer would be false. In tier 3, you actually do need a comparison group, but it can be a smaller study relative to tier 2, and it could be a study that is not quite as rigorous. It should have comparison group equivalents, but without getting into the weeds, you can correct for inequivalence using covariance analyses and so on. So it's a beginning study. It can be small. It doesn't have to have a great many students or a lot of rigor. To reach tier 2, though, which is a moderate level, we are looking for more rigor and a larger study that would have at least 350 students. By the way, the 350 can be in the control group or comparison group and the intervention group. So you don't need 350 just in the intervention. But for many vendors, publishers, that's still a large number of students, and in smaller school districts where the study might be conducted, so oftentimes that's a challenge. You also need to have more than one district or school. Usually that bar can be reached by being in one school district and working with multiple schools. The RCT study, the randomized control trial, is very similar in requirements to the quasi-experimental design. I should have said that, the QED. That too would have 350 students, more than one district or school. But you also you need to have sampling equivalence, but usually that's taken care of with randomization. This kind of study, a randomized control trial, sometimes is called the gold standard, strong evidence, but it's very challenging to do. And oftentimes a QED is actually a more realistic study. And we go back and forth on this. In my center, a lot of times we feel that going for an RCT where you're trying to tell teachers that they're randomly assigned to do treatment X or treatment Y is not natural. It's not the way school districts usually do things. Usually programs are selected on the basis of a school's interests or a principal's interests or a teacher's interests, not on the basis of a coin flip. So although an RCT is held sometimes in high regard, it has a lot of what we call internal validity. Many of us in the field feel that it has less external validity. It's less realistic, more challenging to do, but you need to make your own decision on that. Before I get to evidence dissemination for a few minutes, I did want to just make a couple of comments that although these ESSA tiers have been very effective, I think, in terms of they've had important impacts on program developers and publishers needing to show that their programs work. I know for many of you that might be on this webinar, it's a pain to have to do that. In the old days, you didn't have to do a study. They do have expense to them, but I think you'd have to admit they make your programs better. And those of you from school districts, yeah, procurement's more difficult. Sometimes there's a program you really want to use and it doesn't have the evidence that it needs. But I think you'd also admit that it's made you more observant of programs actually having proof of effectiveness. Whereas in the old days, you probably relied almost exclusively on peer recommendations, what the next school district was doing, but they may not be like you. And you also relied on marketing outreach, so which is much less reliable. So the fact that you're being asked to look at evidence, I think, has helped us all. But I do want to say, as you vet programs for evidence, please keep in mind that not every program is created equal in its propensity to show moderate to strong evidence. A program in reading is easier to show evidence than a program in science because there aren't a lot of standardized testing in science, and reading, of course, is given more time in schools, and which it should be. It's easier to show evidence in science than in social studies. So a good social studies program may not have strong evidence because there aren't a lot of standardized tests in social studies. It's easier to show results in a regular ed program, in a tier 1 program, than in a special ed program, in a tier 2 or tier 3 program, based on the availability of students and how programs work. It's easier to show evidence in a core reading program than in a supplemental program. A lot of you school districts who are listening to the webinar probably use many supplemental programs, but it's not easy for a program that's used 30 hours in an entire school year to move the needle on a standardized test, and we need that to take into account. It's easier to show evidence in a reading program or math program than a program devoted to professional development in the science of reading or community building. Those programs take time to move the needle, and we are so impatient. And it's easier to show evidence in academic subjects than in social emotional learning or classroom management. We don't have as many measures. So as you vet programs, please be understanding about their propensity to be able to get tier 3, tier 2, or tier 1. And now I'll go quickly to evidence dissemination, and I'll try to do this one in a couple of minutes, but it's very important. Where do you go to find out about evidence? And I totally agree that peer recommendations are very important. And as a matter of fact, in my center, we're going to be trying increasingly to put school districts in touch with actual users of programs so that if you don't know anyone who's used a particular program, you can talk to a school district like yours that's used it. For many years, we've had the What Works Clearinghouse, but it's been defunded. Back a number of years ago, 8 years ago, we developed as a service to the field evidence for ESSA. We really did this feeling that the What Works Clearinghouse only can review so many studies a year. They didn't get the information out very quickly, and we thought there would be much interest and need for something for a clearinghouse that provided evidence on more programs. So we developed Evidence for ESSA. Today, Evidence for ESSA reviews over 400 studies a year, and we generally review them within a few months of study completion. Presently, the website contains over 1,100 different programs. We're adding new ones constantly. It has had over 1 million users since 2018. We have over 10,000 users to the website every month, and we have 10,000, actually it's gone up to 11,000 newsletter subscribers. So I encourage you who are school districts not only to talk to peers, not only to do your own research, but use Evidence for ESSA and the What Works Clearinghouse to find out what works. The next slide, and that'll be it for me, will show you a QR code that you could use if you would like to subscribe. It's free. We don't have ads. We don't sign you up for contests for a trip to the Caribbean or something. We just provide a newsletter 4 times a year that indicates what programs have been reviewed, new policies and evidence, tips for evaluating evidence, and so on. So feel free to sign up and you'll be getting the very next newsletter. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ross. That was so informative. I really appreciated how you broke down all of those tiers of evidence and clearly defined them for our viewers. There's one thing that I was hoping to get you to talk about, and that's briefly, the terms statistical significance and effect size often come up in research, and I'm wondering if you could just briefly tell our listeners today what those mean in relationship to those ESSA tiers.
All right, I will definitely try not to do a geeky long response.
But you're good at layman's term response.
I was actually better in my youth, but I'll give it the best shot. In order to qualify for tiers 3, 2, and 1 on ESSA, you do need to get statistically significant results. And that basically means that you reject the null hypothesis that there is no difference. In other words, put into common language, you are getting trustworthy evidence that the intervention is likely to have made a difference. However, and here I'm going to be really quick and try not to do Stat 101, if you have a very, very large effect size, like 4,000 students in the control group and 4,000 students in the intervention group, even a very trivial difference might be significant. So some of you publishers and vendors who are in a situation where you have to do a small study that doesn't have a lot of students, it's much more difficult to get statistical significance because you are what is called underpowered to reject the null hypothesis. The bigger the sample size, the better the chances of getting significance. But statistical significance doesn't mean meaningful. Doesn't mean it's important, doesn't mean it's worth your procurement and your hard-earned dollars. Let's say you have 10,000 students in a study of a new reading intervention, and it's compared against 10,000 students who use business as usual, and you get a 2-point difference on a standardized test. And that 2-point difference produces an effect size of 0.02. And what does that 0.02 mean? That means that it's moved the needle by 2/100ths of a standard deviation. It's statistically significant, but is that important? Is that worth changing what teachers are doing and teachers like to bring in a new program? And then finally, a vendor or publisher can only arrange a small study. They don't get statistical significance. And they're not going to make it to tier 3, but they're on the edge. But they get an effect size of 0.25. That means that they move the needle. They moved a whole group of students a quarter of a standard deviation, and picture a normal curve adjusting by that amount. That is very meaningful, but we haven't proven it yet. Add a new district or a new school, and we'll tack that on to your present results, get you to significance, and then that school district will have confidence in adopting you. So I hope I did okay, Amanda.
You did great, Dr.
All right.
Ross. Thank you so much. Great. So now we're going to turn it over to Teresa from Ed Reports to talk to us about the role that Ed Reports plays in all of this. We heard from Dr. Ross about the role of research, but you guys play a very important role in terms of standards alignment, and I thought it'd be important to pair the two together in this conversation. So Teresa, please tell us what you do at Ed Reports and the role in this space.
Absolutely. Thank you, Amanda. And on behalf of Ed Reports, thanks for having us be a part of this conversation. I really thought Dr. Ross was going to steal my thunder when he said something really big happened in 2015. And like ESSA, yeah, sort of big, but Ed Reports launched as an organization in 2015, and we launched in response to this growing need in the field around understanding whether or not instructional materials are aligned to college and career ready standards. And so if you think back 10 years ago, right, at the time, and you can jump right to the next slide, Sierra. Thanks so much. At the time, publishers were responding to broad-scale shifts in standards, and states and districts were wondering if the claims these publishers were making were indeed accurate, right? Were those stickers on the front of the textbook that they are aligned, was that real? And so Ed Reports was developed to evaluate these instructional materials based on the quality of their design. So how well they structure evidence-based teaching and learning to support college and career-ready standards. And so to do this, and this is the piece I really want to highlight here in our mission statement, we work with teams of educators. So those that are really in the field working with students every day. And it's those educators that evaluate the instructional materials. And so if you'll shift to that next slide for me. So what does that mean and what is our role? So we publish free reviews of soon to be pre-K, but right now K through 12 instructional materials. And our reports evaluate comprehensive core curriculum materials for their alignment to college and career ready standards, learning research, and other indicators of quality. And we publish all of this in our review criteria. And so our review criteria and our processes are publicly available, and they're published on our website right alongside our reports in order to help states, districts, and schools better evaluate instructional materials. And so we look at the evidence in materials and if that evidence supports the claims of alignment. So very different from what Dr. Ross was just talking about. We are very much looking at, do the claims of the publishers that these materials align to the standards, is that what's happening in the materials? And if a school or a teacher was to take these materials as written and implement in their classroom, are they going to meet the criteria that we've set forth? And so that's just a big distinction to make. And then we also work and encourage states and districts to have reflection and conversation around quality, alignment, and usability, which are the 3 gateways that we look at. And so importantly, I want to say too, something that we've heard Dr. Ross talk about, there's a lot of things in the field for states and districts to think about when they're thinking about instructional materials quality. And Ed Reports is one piece of that. And we're a place to start to think about this conversation, but it's not the ending point. And so I want to be really clear, and I'm looking forward to hearing what our district counterparts say in the commentary, but districts should look to Ed Reports as this piece of a thoughtful adoption process. And so we're a tool to use, and we can help communicate what is in the materials as it relates to our specific criteria. Next slide, please. And so since we've been around just about 10 years, we've had a pretty big impact in the field. So I just wanted to highlight that. We have over 1,100 of our reports published, and 43 state departments of ed have drawn on ed reports in some way or another to promote high quality instructional materials. And so that is a lot of students that have been impacted by our work. So that's something that's really exciting for us as we look at the past decade of the work that we've done here at Ed Reports. Next slide, please. And so, as I mentioned, all of our resources are free and publicly available for states, districts, and schools to use, and they are here on our website. If you go to edreports.org/reports, you will see our Reports Center. So we encourage you, if you have not been a user of Ed Reports, to feel free to dig in and check them out. Next slide, please. So part of why we're here, right, and why we're a part of this conversation is we know that instructional materials matter. They are a huge expenditure for districts, and there's something that stays in the system for a really long time. So on average, right, a school district will adopt materials every 5 to 7 years. And then after that, that can affect an entire cohort of students. And we know from our work that while high quality instructional materials are widely available, they're not always being used consistently in classrooms. And so what we've seen in recent survey data is only 35% of ELA, 51% of math, and 6% of science teachers have reported using them regularly. So we define regularly as about once per week or more. And so why is this? We know they're available. We know that they're a huge change agent, but we're not seeing this in the implementation of those materials. And so we know districts are operating with limited resources and capacity. There is a big competition amongst different initiatives in schools, and there's a challenge to designing a fully comprehensive adoption process. So we know that district leaders, school leaders, teachers are stretched thin in a variety of ways, but we also know that this is a pretty large change agent. And so we wanted to dig in a little bit more and learn more about this. And so if you click to the next slide, to further understand kind of all of these dynamics at play in the field, we partnered with the Decision Lab to conduct a comprehensive survey of over 250 district leaders and educators to kind of gain this deeper understanding of all the different factors that are influencing district adoption of high quality instructional materials. And if you go to the next slide, please. And so what did we find? Well, if you look at this slide, we found that there is really strong agreement across the ecosphere that instructional materials matter. 87% of our respondents either agreed or strongly agreed that instructional materials matter. So we know that that is there, right? We know if you look at the next kind of categories here, folks are agreeing on what strong alignment in their district looks like, what that criteria for identifying high quality instructional materials is, and that they have confidence that their district can identify and adopt high quality instructional materials. So this is sort of this widespread consensus around both the importance of instructional materials as well as the key criteria for quality. And this creates a really promising foundation that we're finding for districts to build upon. But this is where it gets interesting. If you shift to the next slide, please. So then we started asking about the challenges that districts have, because as you recall, right, we know that instructional materials are important, but we're not seeing them used the way that we would like to in classrooms. And so at Ed Reports, we think about the adoption process as more than just the discrete selection of materials. It spans from the preparation of the process to determining your local needs and priorities, to evaluating and investigating the materials, and to making the decision. But it doesn't end there, right? It moves into implementation. And as you can see in the data above, that's where we're finding that districts are really facing their largest challenges is in these end phases of the process around bringing consensus and stakeholder buy-in and implementing the materials. And so not shown above, but relating to the point that Dr. Ross was making earlier as well, the survey also told us that districts are struggling with assessing efficacy. As he had mentioned, it's a really challenging process. And we know that, right? As we think about districts that are piloting and implementing materials, only 19% of the respondents in our survey strongly agreed that their district has a process in place for evaluating efficacy. And so that gives us a lot of things to kind of think about here. And then if you shift to the next slide, we're going to see a really interesting tension in this data because districts are self-reporting those previous challenges and kind of these late stage activities around stakeholder buy-in and implementation. But in this question, where we ask them kind of where their other challenges lie, they highlight these really early stage challenges around infrastructure and regulatory compliance, and they rank these as the most critical priorities. And so we were grappling with this data, and we think there's a real opportunity here for districts to understand kind of this dichotomy of what is important, and using that to really kind of backmap foundational planning to set up success in earlier stages. Another thing that the Surge survey examined, which we're not going to get into deeply here, but how districts value external support. So we know that there's a lot of partners in the field that are eager to help districts, right? We know this is a really big piece of work. And overwhelmingly, the responses there centered around how external partners can help districts interpret data around curriculum options, how they can investigate and evaluate materials on their shortlist, and of course, the big challenge of implementation. So what we're seeing here is that districts aren't really asking for help in making the decisions, but they're looking for support in some of these more resource-intensive pieces where internal resources and capacity may not be enough. An interesting misalignment, though, does appear around this consensus building piece. It was ranked as one of the second highest challenge, but it was ranked fairly lowly in an area where districts are looking for external support. Only about 18% of districts highlighted that as an area for external support. But this probably reflects like a district view that this is a very deeply internal process for them and requires kind of this local leadership and knowledge to really bring their stakeholders in. And so when we think about what does all of this mean, how can we take this data and interpret it in ways that we can help districts set their processes up for success, we developed these 4 kind of calls to action. Where we hope that district leaders can kind of lean in and strengthen their processes in these areas if they haven't already. And so that first area, call to action around establishing a strong foundation early, understanding your local, state, federal requirements, assessing your infrastructure. Those are really important things to do up front. And in the paper, we provide resources and links for districts to think about these areas. And then
I think you have a slide on that, Teresa, but I don't see it here.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
There we
yeah,
go.
there we
Next slide.
go.
I got
Yeah,
all caught up in talking. There we
yeah.
go.
So here they are, your calls to
Thanks.
action. Mhm.
Thanks, Amanda. So our next call to action is designing a comprehensive adoption process to plan for implementation from day one, rather than treating selection and implementation as separate activities. So we know that these are 2 really big pieces, but it doesn't stop once you adopt the materials, right? The key to getting those materials to being used in classroom is really successful implementation. And so for spending the time up front to really plan for that piece, right? Really have a clear instructional vision, the understanding of your local needs, and create a detailed roadmap that really extends into a multi-year implementation plan is essential for that level of success. And then center educator voices while building your broad stakeholder consensus through structured engagement processes. We know bringing your stakeholders in early is important. All of the different pieces that you can do to bring those folks on board or early increases the chance of buy-in. and then leveraging external expertise strategically for high value aspects of the adoption process. So we know districts are kind of at max and for capacity and resources. And so there are many resources out there that can help districts with those areas that they identified as high needs. So those are our kind of 4 calls to action out of 4. Amanda, I am open to any questions you have. Oh, you're on mute, Amanda.
Thank you. I was just saying that I was really struck by the slide that you had up before that highlighted some of the challenges that districts face. The one about technology infrastructure was interesting for me. I did have a question, though, about evaluation tools, and I wondered if that was referring specifically to like checklist or administrator look forwards to ensure appropriate implementation. Could you speak a little bit more to that?
Yeah, so what we do at Ed Reports is what we've done is create our criteria. And as I said, our criteria and our reports are a place to start. And so what we do is really encourage states and districts that use our reports to identify what are their most local needs, right? Who are their students? Where do those needs fit in? And how then can they look at the indicators in our criteria that will give them the most information that they can do to make the best decision they can about their local populations, their local students, their local teachers. And so we know there's not a one size fits all process. We don't say like, these are the best instructional materials, because the best instructional materials for District A are probably very different than the best instructional materials for District B. And so what we do is really look at those materials as they're designed and as they meet our criteria. And we provide as much evidence as we can as to how those materials meet that criteria so that districts can make that important decision based on their local needs. And so we do provide a handful of resources around the adoption process that districts can look at and use and adapt to their own local needs. But I would really push that it is very important for them to think about what it is that they need. What are their students? Who are their teachers? What's going to most fit their local capacity before kind of just jumping in and saying, oh, this has a high Ed Reports rating, it must be great. It meets our criteria, but does it meet the needs of your students? And so that's something that we really encourage folks to think about.
Knowing their own local context.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then, I asked Dr. Ross about a buzzword flying around in terms of statistical significance and effect size. And I think one that I hear a lot of in your space is HQIM.
Yeah.
And it's an acronym for high quality instructional materials. Can you say a little bit more about what that is and its role now in this process?
Absolutely. So high quality instructional materials, you're right, HQIM has become a buzz acronym in the education space. And there are states that define it in different ways. Here at Ed Reports, we think that high quality instructional materials are those materials that meet our criteria. But right, in a state that has slightly different criteria based on their local context, they might have something different to look at, but really it means that those materials are going to meet like the needs of your students as strongly as they can. And so here at Ed Reports, we consider high quality instructional materials those that really meet the criteria that we have outlined as high standards, learning expectations, research in the field. And so that's a really big process for us to gather all of that and what it means. And so that is what we do also release on our website. In addition to our reports, is that this is the criteria that we are evaluating these reports against, or these materials against, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Teresa. And now we are going to turn to Janine. There you are, Janine. Hello, friend.
Hello.
Thanks so much for being here. So you are a provider. You're a curriculum provider. Some say vendor. Others prefer the term partner. And I'd love to hear your reactions to what you've just heard from both Dr. Ross and Teresa.
Well, loved all of what I heard. And, I've done a lot of work with Dr. Ross over the last several years. And so I'm always learning from him and understanding how we can best demonstrate that things work in the classroom. And I loved hearing from Teresa that link between selection and implementation, which is really critical for us here at EPS Learning. So we are a developer. We create and publish and sell and help districts implement and partner to make decisions all around those high quality instructional materials that you just described. So we focus mainly on intervention for students who are striving readers. So these may be students who did not get appropriate instruction when they were younger. They may be multilingual learners. They may be students with disabilities. They may have missed some school for some reason. The pandemic, for example, a lot of our students missed a lot of school. And so we are in the business of helping those students who need to catch up on their reading skills. So it's critical for us to understand the efficacy of our products. And it's even more important for us to understand what makes those products usable for educators. And so a lot of our research now is about just that. We've kind of gotten through the, basic research on does this particular structured literacy program work? And by the way, structured literacy does work. So you've probably heard explicit, sequential, cumulative learning when we talk about foundational literacy. And we talk about the 5 pillars, does it have phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension included in an integrated way? What you may not have heard yet is something called the decoding threshold. So we know that kids have to get to a certain fluency level in order to then get ready to make meaning out of text. So although we're including all 5 pillars of reading in our programs, we also have to pay particular attention to those foundational skills, to those phonemic awareness, phonics, and fluency skills for students with those early literacy gaps. So we do all of that. And I always use the metaphor of thinking about aspirin. So we know aspirin works for a variety of things, right? It's going to reduce fever. It's going to reduce inflammation, those kinds of things that we use aspirin for. It's going to prevent heart disease for some populations, but it's not for every population. We don't really have to study aspirin anymore per se to know that aspirin works, but we probably need to study if we put a new coating on the aspirin, if we have a particular packaging on the aspirin that makes it hard for people to get to it. And so that's kind of where we're seeing our research shift a little bit now to seeing how do we make our reading programs usable for teachers? How can we get teachers up and running with a program very, very quickly? Because we know once they get past some of that fear that some of educators have when they start teaching foundational literacy, if we can get beyond that and we can coach them in partnership with our districts, that we can ensure that all students have access to the literacy programs they so desperately need.
Yeah.
And I'll say one more. Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I want to say one more thing. And,
Sure, I have a thought that came to mind.
And so the other area that we're working really hard on now is how to work in partnership with districts to tell the story that they need to tell. So, I was a special ed teacher for a number of years. I was a building level principal, and I was a superintendent. And when I moved into that superintendent seat, I had to demonstrate to my school board what was working. And I didn't have the capacity to figure that out on my own. I needed my partners in, vendors or whatever you want to call any of us. We're all in this together. I relied on them to help us tell our stories. And so the first question we ask when we partner with a district is, what does success look like for you? What do you want to show in your district? And some districts will say, I just need to move the needle on my test scores. And other districts will say, I want kids to come to school because they're learning how to read. I want to reduce absenteeism, and I know that if I give them the right interventions, they're going to be more likely to come to school. And I had a district last week that I was really excited about this new partnership. This is a new district we're working with. And this district leader said, I want my educators to feel confident in their capacity to meet the literacy needs of their middle school students. That's what I'm looking for. And so in each of these incidents, we are going to have a case study that is, I'm sorry, somebody just opened the door behind me. So in these types of things, this isn't an efficacy study necessarily, but this is a case study that helps a district tell the story of success in their community for what's important to them at that moment, the way that Teresa just described.
Thanks, Janine. It was great to hear you speak, and that's especially why you and your colleagues at EPS were invited to this conversation, to speak about how far advanced you are in terms of research past the foundational piece and thinking more about it in nuanced ways. And really, I guess, in terms of like implementation science. I would love for you to, that's your buzzword question. If you could speak a little bit about what is implementation science, and how does it relate to what we're speaking about?
We think a lot about implementation science and about implementation in general for the reasons I described. It could be the best program in the world. If it doesn't get used properly, it's not going to work. And so we look at it from a variety of perspectives. So we start with, what's the initial training a teacher might need just to get started? And what is going to help them take the plunge? Because there's a lot of fear in getting started. For some teachers, for teachers who have been doing this a long time and maybe using some methods that were flawed, and now they're learning because there's so much, attention to reading these days. And sometimes teachers go through a bit of a grieving process, thinking about those kids that they didn't meet their needs maybe in previous years. And so it's not just about what teachers are going to do, it's about what they're going to not do. So if you begin to use the science of reading and perhaps in previous years you didn't, well, what are some of the things you need to stop doing in order to implement what works now? It's very interesting when you look at the numbers, and you'll hear all the time it takes 2 to 3 years to implement a program. I don't believe that. I don't. And I'll tell you from my own experiences as a teacher and as a school leader and as a district leader, it doesn't take 2 to 3 years to implement a program. You generally see this dip in the data that first year and sometimes even into the second year. And it's the third year when you see the data start to improve if it's a good program and it's implemented properly. But that dip in that first year especially is usually because of the things people won't let go of. And so you stop doing a few of the things that you used to do, but you're still doing some of them. And you're doing enough of them that you can't fully commit to the new thing that's happening. So you get this like mixture of programs and approaches, and oftentimes you lose the things that actually were working before, but you haven't quite got good at the things that would work if you tried them. And so what I'm convinced of, just in spending, I'm now, around 40 years in doing this work. And what I am convinced of is the full commitment of implementing something that is research-based, research-aligned, that we know works, fully committing to it, and also simultaneously saying, you know what, I'm going to stop doing those other things because I only have so much time in the day. And if I'm going to fully implement this new thing, I've got to let go of some other things. And I think when we do that well, when we help teachers in the change management process, sometimes in the grieving process, when we help folks build in support for teachers as they're implementing programs, and we recognize how hard it is and make sure we are holding them up as they go through that process, then we're going to see results. And you're going to see them fast. Our research tells us that we can see them really fast when we approach it in that way.
Thank you, Janine. And that's a nice transition now to a conversation with our practitioners, Sean, David, and Bren. Hello, friends.
Good afternoon.
Thanks so much for being here and taking time out of your very busy schedules to join this conversation that I know was so real and pertinent to all of you. I'd love to just open it up and hear from each of you your initial reactions to what you heard, and If there's something that you heard that really resonated with you, we'd love to hear it.
I put this in the chat, but I think you have to see an adoption process as the first step of implementation as well. And I think we came across this by a happy accident. We looked at the instructional materials. We made sure we had fit, and we wanted to implement because ESSER was running out, and that we were going to use ESSER funds to pay for it. But there were some texts that we were unsure that our community would it would resonate with us. So we actually came across this adoption process of testing everything out to address that problem. And it's helped so much with implementation because the teachers got to field test it. They thought that we were doing with them and not to them. And instead of having just typically we would have a core group of teachers, we had teachers from across the spectrum. So we saw what our rookie teachers were doing as well as our veteran teachers. And that in and of itself, that process really helped with the implementation.
Thanks, Sean. David or Bren, your initial thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate all the work and research that has been shared in resources, right? So just, as I'm digging into a new job in a new school district, I see there are some things that were shared today that could really be very useful. One of the things that really resonated with me was this importance of centering educators' voice in the selection of materials. And I guess to Dr. Stover's point of people feeling like things are being done to them and not with them, like how critical this is. But also one part of, I think that principle or that strategy that was shared is that you have to do that centering of the educator's voice in tandem with building broad stakeholder consensus. So yes, educator voice is critically important, but we also need to think about our students, our families, those other stakeholders who are going to be experiencing that curriculum and who we also need to own and enjoy that learning. So I feel like that broad stakeholder engagement is also something that, sometimes school districts have a tendency to do it in a way that it's more, you feel like it's just done as an afterthought, not intentionally building that broad stakeholder engagement. And then the final piece, just of that one principle, that principle itself was just so rich. The final part of that was thinking about structured engagement. Like it shouldn't be haphazard. It needs to be intentionally well planned in ways that folks feel like you're getting their feedback and that feedback is very clear how that feedback is going to be used in the decision-making process. So very helpful to hear. And it also reminds me of ways in which I've done that well and things that I haven't done so well when I've not really been aligned to that principle.
Thanks, Bren. And David.
Yep, I ditto what Sean and Bren said. I will add one element that I thought was really well done here. Too often districts implement initiatives without research-based efficacy. And in DCPS, we were so rich with resources, we often tried to tie something to what we did without truly testing the impact of that, without making sure that what we were saying was the reason this happened was actually the reason. And I think it's just a good learning tool for every superintendent, any district educator who makes decisions that affect kids, to make sure that the research is peer reviewed, that it's well founded, that it applies to the kids and similar to the work that you're doing on the ground. The other thing I thought that really stood out was when and if I get your name wrong, I apologize, Dr. Walker Caffey, testing the efficacy of our products. This is really, really important. Just coming in the superintendency, I've only been in the work now for about a month. And as I met with every team, my big question was, how do we know this is working? How do we know this is the variable that is either leading to student results or that isn't leading to that? And it's really important that we don't use jargon in those spaces. I was thinking about Howard Gardner talking about how multiple intelligences was misapplied in the research for decades by superintendents and district leaders about learning styles. And so I found it very strong that today's session was broken up into research, implementation, and then the efficacy of that work. So that as we think about this, I think if we apply those three principles, we can make sure that what we're doing to kids is the same quality of information that we would do before any doctor gave a patient medicine, that we make sure that there is efficacy to that product, that it is implemented well, and that we actually test the results of that in real time with good data. That's what stood out to me, and I thought it was really impressive how we brought all this together. I will say, Dr. Ross, I earned my doctorate from Johns Hopkins, and if I had you teaching the null hypothesis in that span of time, everything would have made much more sense. But thank you. This was very well done.
Dr. Ross is the best, that fellow Yankee fan of mine.
And even though he's a Yankee fan, he is great in the research.
You know, I was thinking a lot about the role of implementation and how you guys as district leaders, you all had, like, one of the most critical roles that you all had was sort of as a principal supervisor, an assistant superintendent, instructional superintendent. In that role, that's really where the rubber hits the road. That is really, I mean, that was my most impactful work when I think back on my entire career. I loved my instructional suit job, the absolute best. And so I'm wondering, you know, leaning from that past experience, you know, what do you gather in terms of monitoring implementation? You know, how do you enter schools and look to see, you know, if things are happening as they should? Can you talk a little bit about that work, and maybe if there were tools that you used to monitor? Please speak to that.
I can. We have a pretty rich data platform that is actually tied to our principal evaluation process. So for instance, whatever our district focus is, we try to make sure that there is some evidence that we are able to collect, and we ask principals to collect, and that we go over with them on a regular basis. So for instance, last year we were, and we still are, very concerned about engagement. So we created an engagement walkthrough, and we set standards for our principals to do those engagement walkthroughs, and then their supervisors went over it with them. Same thing with, we were implementing the science of reading. We had some key measures that we asked principals to track and that we would track, and then we had discussions. And I think in all this tracking, the one thing that's lost that I really want to stamp here is it's really important to analyze what you do well before you look at what you're not doing well. We did not necessarily get the growth we wanted to this year in our scores. And what we did was brought in the principals who got the growth and said, what did you do? And we used that conversation as our 4 cores. And it was very simple. They gave immediate feedback. They were visible. They used the resources that we provided, and they were involved in the data conversations with teachers regularly. Not hard, but we were able to say, see how this works. This is what we do here.
And it's also very positive. I mean,
Yeah.
Instead of starting with the negative, you know,
Right.
But let's start with these examples of where this is working in our own district.
That's right.
Strategy, Sean. Bren or David, in terms of monitoring implementation of new curricular programs?
I'd be happy to weigh in. I don't know, Brent, if you pause, but it took me about 10 years in the instructional soup role to finally get this right. But I will tell you, monitoring systems that are tight in structure and in time was really important. Every 6 weeks, I would meet with my principals to say, what are our inputs for the next 6 weeks based on our comprehensive school plan? What are the strategies that we're doing, that we're saying we're doing in every room? And then it was monitored in 2 ways. One, who actually implemented it with fidelity, and then looking at the student results from implementation with fidelity. Then who implemented it, but perhaps not with fidelity, and were their results different? And then who didn't implement it, and what were the results were? This led to 2 pieces of accountability. One, you can't measure outputs if you're not properly measuring inputs. And I think too often we focus as district leaders on outputs, and then we get very unhealthy inputs. And then we make bad inferences from that. What I found was that if we wanted to really measure the impact of the strategy we were doing, we were going hard on writing just close reads at the high school level, the secondary level, and making sure that kids could actually write prompts, response to prompts that are effective, that align to the part rubric, right? They could actually write a 4-level response or 3-level response. But when we actually looked at the results, there were about 30% of our teachers implementing that with fidelity, and they had the highest results. So when we showed that if you implement this with fidelity, this is the result you're getting with your kids. And we were doing this every 6 weeks last year. We had substantial gains last year in all our schools, 10, 20, 30% in some, but it really involved tight timelines, measuring the inputs and the outputs. And there is a difference between inputs with fidelity and inputs that are just, hey, I'm doing this checklist. And if you measure the data in that way, you can really hold principals and teachers accountable in a way that feels legit. And you can pivot quickly too if something isn't working. So that was something I learned from the experience, that even now in this role, I'm like, okay, tight timelines, look at the strategy, tell me the inputs, how do we know the inputs are working? And let's pivot if they're not, instead of investing in something just because we said it was the right way to go. I think that was my biggest learning from that.
Yeah, those timelines are definitely a crucial. You've got to map out the school year. Typical school year is about 36 to 40 weeks, and from the start of the year, you map it out and find those critical intervals around the breaks, and courts adjust, as you said, in time to make a difference. Sean, were you going to say something?
Yeah, and just real quickly, to piggyback, that also helps with implementation, because if you can show it works here, then others want to do what's successful. Sorry to talk over you, Bryn.
Oh, no, I was just going to add, I think there's some research, hopefully research, I may be quoting this wrong out there, that says about 90% of initiatives fail due to poor implementation. And so, you can buy all the products you want to, but if you are not tight on implementation, you're not going to get the results that you want. And it reminded me of work I recently did working with Innovation Project in North Carolina, where we were supporting 74 schools across the state and in rural areas to really think about improving the quality of instruction in their building. And we were leaning into the instructional core work by Elmore. And, we got to see when we're implementing something, we have to see if we're implementing a new curriculum, we should see changes in teacher practice, in student task. And oftentimes, folks will just lean into is the curriculum being implemented, but not, and I think this is kind of what David was pointing out, you're not really looking at how has this now changed our teacher practice? How has this now changed the level of task, the level of engagement, what our students are doing, and how are you really monitoring that in a way that where it is that you need to provide either additional training or support. Because if you've implemented the curriculum and the instruction still looks like it always did, and the teachers are doing what they already did, you're going to get the results that you always have gotten. So you just really have to be intentional and strategic around those things.
Thanks, Bryn. Really, what we're all talking about, though, is building teacher capacity, ultimately.
Absolutely.
And, professional development, which definitely plays a critical role in all of this. Sean, were you going to say something? And then I'd like everyone to respond to the PD piece.
Yeah. And safety, creating a sense of safety. We try to say we're a learning organization. So if you fail, that's fine. We now know what not to do. Yeah. That's critically important in implementation.
Yeah.
But to your point about the professional development, teacher capacity, I think that is one of the key things. You can't just lay out a new curriculum. If for teachers, they have to have the skills, and you've got to take the time to train and to coach and build their ability to implement that new level of curriculum. Again, if you don't do that, if you don't change their practice, then you're going to get the same results that you already did. And it takes time. It's tedious. And I love what Sean just pointed out about, building a safe culture so that when teachers don't get it right the first time or they struggle with you, you just continue to work with them and meet them at their point of need. I mean, it's almost like a tiered response for teachers, like you tier your response for students, because folks are at different levels of development. And you can't, and I can tell you I'll end with this. The one thing we found out in some of our work in North Carolina in the implementation of curriculum, oftentimes people think it's the 0 to 3 teachers that need the support, but it turned out to be those 15 to 20-year teachers, like who are so set in their ways that knew what was the right thing to do, and they were not going to budge. They were not going to do anything different. So you got to really think about both those newbies, those new teachers, but also those folks who have just practiced it wrong for so long that getting them to change how they do things is really a heavy lift as well.
And that's where we really double down on safety, because what you're saying, especially with the science of reading, is you did it wrong. And nobody wants to hear that, because they're going to immediately fight back and say, hey, look, I've got all these results. Look at my results. I didn't do it wrong. And so you can't approach it that way. You have to say, hey, we're a learning organization, so we know a little bit better. And this is how it helps our kids. And we got much better buy-in with that.
And it's important for leaders to model learning.
That's
and
right.
To be the lead learner, to actually sit in some of those sessions, whether you're a superintendent sitting in with principals or a principal sitting in with teachers, and rolling up your sleeves and showing your vulnerability and humility around the things that you didn't know before. They say know better, do better. So that's really what this work is about. I have another question for the three of you, and this question is for all of my provider friends out there, all of my vendor friends who are really trying hard to recruit districts to partner with them on research studies. You guys need the tier 1 and the tier 2 evidence to buy a program, but we need, those of us in the vendor space need you to be a participant. There's no research without, subjects or participants. So talk to us a little bit about how you view research and partnering with vendors. And Janine, I welcome you to chime in on this conversation too, if you want to, come off mute and speak, because this, I know, is one that you and others in the space have a lot to say about. But yeah, what does it take for you guys to say yes and to want to be a partner to a provider?
For me, it's alignment to our core values and to what we're trying to accomplish as a district. It's just that simple. You have to have the communication. You can't, just because your superintendent friend said it was a good idea. It might have been a good idea for that time and place. It might not be a good idea for your time and place. So you have to have specific conversations and almost an interview rubric, and you can't be afraid to say no. And we do lots of research, and we're actually part of the innovation project of which Brent spoke about. And I think being a part, we were in the founding districts before I got there, and being a part of a group of districts that do research has helped us more than just dip our toe into it. We go full force where we can. We actually now proactively reach out to university partners and people we know will do high quality and understand our district to do research, so that we can have the absolute best practices in our district.
Okay, so all my vendor partner friends out there, you heard Rockingham County.
And I would just say, for me, that research, and my background, I'm a scientist by training, so I have a degree in chemistry, and I'm always leaning into the hypothesis and the evidence. So I think it's critical, because I think the research helps us get better, and it also helps us see what we can't see. Because, oftentimes you're trying to, like, why is this not working? We feel like we're doing everything. And I think it is helpful to have entities that can come in and help us see what we are not seeing. I recently heard our superintendent here in Philly talk about, a time in a district that he worked where, it was a very large scale initiative where a lot of money was spent, and they really didn't take the time to gather data around, you get 3 years in and you haven't really taken the time to stop and reflect and say, what's going well, what's not going well, where do we need to pivot? And then you end up with a lot of wasted time, wasted money, and most importantly, not getting the outcomes that children deserve. So I really believe it's critical that we think about how we are that we collaborate more with researchers to help us to get those answers early so that we can pivot as quickly as we can.
Yeah, I would say a couple things. The first thing is if you know our data before you come in and can talk about how your product could potentially move that data, this is a major selling point. I had a vendor write me a LinkedIn the other day, and I mean, I probably get 800 of them a day. This caught my attention. We had just gone over this data, and this vendor knew it and said, Dr. Pinner, I was looking at your data. I've got some wonderings about how our product could align, but I wanted to talk to you first. I know it's a salesman strategy, right? But let me just share with you that not every product works for every district or every school. And when a vendor starts off trying to sell their product as if it can fit anything, sort of like the Brady Bunch spoof where he
The
builds
trench coat.
Yes.
You got this, I got it.
Yes, it's an immediate see you
Turn
later.
off.
Yes, it's deleted before you finish it. The second piece is I want to do the research in everything that we are doing right now, developing our strategic plan. I have asked, like Bren and Sean, who is our research partner on this so that we can track the efficacy of this work and determine whether people should replicate it or whether it's not enough information and we need to go further. I don't think we should be doing anything in districts without a research partner to it. If a vendor wanted to do that with me, I would be absolutely open to that as long as they could show that their research principles were as good as Dr. Ross's, right? I've had vendors share white papers with me that were not thorough enough.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think it's really important. I think it's okay to say, like, this is what we know, right? Like Bandura was studying efficacy of whether people feared snakes before efficacy became this huge thing, right? And that's how it began. That's how he tested it. So I think it's okay to say, here's what we know, that when kids get this, and we believe this product ties to this, here's how we're going to bring that research. But I think starting off with a piece of our data that you have looked at closely where there could be questions, you just want to probe. And I've been in the sales business, so sometimes probing is very important to hear what the person says. And then you can tie your product to what the person has said rather than assume you have the answer. I think that would get me open to more vendors. The research part, I firmly believe in. We shouldn't do anything without some research as it relates to that. And if you're interested, reach out to me. We're already vetting research partners with vendors right now so that we can start to track this work. The work we do in the schools that we represent, which are juvenile schools where kids are in the system, there is not a ton of research on this. I've said to my team, I want us all to be making millions of dollars in 3 to 5 years because we're going to lead the national work in this. But if there are products or services aligned to that, the thinking of that, whether you're building the efficacy of a kid's belief in themselves, whether you're building short-term learning products where you can get the most efficiency out of getting kids to read and getting kids to fall back in love with school, I would absolutely be open to that. And any research that you wanted to do, we would partner. Sorry.
Well, I'm going to be in touch soon. Yeah, I'm going to be in touch soon. I spent 10 years working with kids in juvenile justice, so I'm super excited.
You're speaking specifically of intervention and catching up the older undercredited student.
That's right. Exactly.
Coding too.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to just
jump into me.
Yeah, thanks. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay. I wanted to say two things. First of all, educational research is super messy. It is so messy. Every time we're in the middle of a study, I think, oh my gosh, we're never going to get to the end of this thing and figure out what's going on. And somehow we get there. But it's very difficult to move from correlation to causation, to understand what's really causing things in educational settings, because there's so many variables, as everybody here knows. So that's one. So if you're going to enter into this research world, and I hope everybody who's a practitioner will entertain that at one point or another, because it is how we all get better collectively and serve the needs of our students better. The second thing I'll say is that we always have to be very wary of unintended consequences and ethics of doing research. And so in the reading intervention space, for example, you can't take away something that's been working for your kids. And I've actually had people say to me, both researchers and superintendents, once in a while, to say, well, we're doing this other program, we're not sure it's working, and so we'll just take that away, and then you can flip a coin and see who gets that one and see who gets, no. And so the first thing we say every time there's a question about grouping kids or how we're doing our study, it's we need to align on what's best for your students first. And we're not going to take away a structured literacy program that you've been using in favor of our structured literacy program. That's not ethical. And we're not going to only implement to kids we flipped a coin for, and whoever got heads gets the reading program. That's not ethical. You can do RCTs in a couple of other ways if you're a large district and you know you only have the capacity to maybe have half of your schools implement in year one, and then you want to shift to the other half in year two. That's a way you can do it, and making sure that you're meeting the needs of all of your students while you're building the capacity of your teachers. And so there are ways to do it. But you have to be really careful. When I was a superintendent, we had somebody who wanted to do a study, and they would have required us to change the bus routes in our pre-K programs in order to get the kids. And I was like, no. And I couldn't kick them out the door fast enough, because what they were going to create for my teachers and my kids and everybody else was pure chaos in the dismissal process. And when you're moving hundreds of 3- and 4-year-olds on buses every day, you don't mess around with that. So that was a weird story, but so it's really messy.
No, it's relevant. It's
yeah.
relevant because I think what you're saying is, vendors need to also be aware of the realities of everyday school life, when they come into a school and want to do this grand research project with Dr. Ross and his team. Things work differently in real life in schools. There's a fire drill, there's cafeteria duty and lunch and all of this. There's picture day and things that get in the way of actually carrying out a study. One of the things I used to do was actually, in my previous role, look at the school district's calendar and map our study and the key activities of the study against the district calendar. So like,
yeah, you got to be respectful.
When is their spring break?
Right.
So we're not testing kids here. When did they come back from the winter holiday? When is all those things have to be taken into account, as a vendor to approach the space that's respectful. These teachers and principals, administrators are giving up a lot of precious time to engage with us, and we owe them, that level of respect and understanding of their contest. It's exactly what you said, David. That vendor who reached out to you and said, hey, I noticed, and took the time to study what is happening, in your district before proposing a solution. So I think that wasn't a crazy comment, Janine. It's real. So I'd invite Dr. Ross and Teresa to hop on the last few minutes, because I feel bad that you guys are off camera. I know you're still there and a part of this conversation in this group. If there's anything that you guys heard that resonated that you'd like to share or chime in, I'd encourage you to speak now.
Well, yeah, I mean, we don't have much time left. I'll try to make some closing comments based upon what I heard, and be quick about it. And actually, I'd like to make some comments that are irreverent, not irrelevant to my field, picking up on what you all said. And the first is, your emphasis on implementation. Implementation from a research perspective is everything. Let's say there's a particular program that's well designed and Teresa has approved it at Ed Reports, and we go to Philadelphia where Brent is, and we implement that program in 30 different schools. We're going to see negative results in some schools, positive results in other schools, and no results in other schools. It's all implementation. And if you're a vendor, don't even start a study unless you're sure you can implement. So implementation is a key. The second thing, to piggyback on what Janine said, RCTs may be the gold standard, but they're also fool's gold. A lot of times you can ruin a study and ruin an intervention. Personally, this is irreverent. I prefer rigorous QEDs. Third, as much as we love the ESSA tiers, they're not a true hierarchy. A program that has tier 1 isn't better than one that has tier 2. It just happened to strike it rich in one study. All you need is one study to have ESSA tier 1. So it doesn't tell the whole story. What tells the story is what you learn from your peer districts, what you learn from Ed Reports, what you learn from Evidence for ESSA.
Triangulate
And on
everything.
that note, just one more thing. Achievement results do not tell the whole story of the efficacy of a program. Teacher perceptions, how they use the program. In Evidence for ESSA, we have added qualitative evidence, what teachers have said, what students have said. I think district people want to know that because sometimes it takes a few years to get the achievement results. If teachers don't like it, it's not going anywhere. And that's my irreverent closing.
We love it. Teresa, a few closing thoughts?
Absolutely. I really just thank you to the superintendents that are here. It's so interesting always to hear from practitioners in the field. And I will be incredibly brief, but I mean, the reason we're all here, right, is to improve outcomes for kids. And so these are all different tools in the toolbox. Ed Reports is one of them, the ESSA tiers are another. And so, we hope to provide districts and schools with as many things as they can to make informed decisions so that they can do the best they can do for the kids. So that is where I will end today. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here today. We do have 1 minute left. Janine, did you want to share a closing thought?
I want to thank everybody on the panel. Thank you, Amanda, for organizing us and leading such a great conversation. And to all of the fellow panelists here, thanks all of you for the work that you do. We're all in this together, so it's important to remember that.
Yes, thank you. And so now I'll turn it back over to the Campaign for Grade Level Reading to close us out exactly on time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you to our panel. Thank you to Amanda for leading this conversation. Today we've really talked about these considerations around the tiers of evidence. To steal from Dr. Ross, the story that they tell and the story that they don't tell, the resource that Ed Reports that adds to the tools in the toolbox around making the decision, around the adoption phase, and then the importance of testing the efficacy of the products. And Janine talked to us a little bit about that. And then for all the superintendents of what that really looks like in practice. These topics of centering on educator voice, of answering the questions around how do we know what's really working, and even the very practical responses of how you've approached this. So Sean, Bren, David, thank you all, really to all of you for taking the time to join this conversation today. To our audience, thank you for joining us. We hope you'll come back for upcoming Learning Tuesday sessions. I've just dropped the link in the chat for you. But next week on Tuesday, we have at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time, a Moonshot series preview, a powerful launchpad for collective learning. And then later in the afternoon at 3 p.m., we have a session with Book Abundance for early learning and development, early literacy, and early school success. And then the following week on October 14th, there's a session co-sponsored by Children's Screens called Screens in the First 5 Years. So those of you who were asking some more pointed questions about early childhood years, that's a great place to jump into some of these conversations. And then on October 21st, a session around parents as curators of their children's education. And so we hope you'll join us. And one final thanks to our panel for the conversation today.